woman by his side. "Chris," Linda said, standing in the living room. "Who is this?" "This is Sharon," Chris said casually, as though introducing a colleague. "She'll be staying here for a while." Linda's heart dropped. "What do you mean, staying here?" "She's pregnant," Chris said, his tone matter of fact. "It's my child." Linda felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. "Your child?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Chris said, his expression unrepentant. "You couldn't give me a child, Linda, so I had to find someone who could." Linda stared at him in disbelief, her chest heaving with pain and anger. "How could you do this to me, Chris? After everything we've been through?" Chris shrugged. "I did what I had to do. You can either accept it or leave." The words hit Linda like a slap. She turned to Sharon, who stood silently, avoiding her gaze. Without another word, Linda stormed upstairs, tears streaming down her face. That night, Linda sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her packed suitcase. She couldn't stay not like this. Chris had crossed a line she couldn't ignore. As she descended the stairs, she found Chris sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady. Chris looked up, surprised. "What?" "I can't do this anymore, Chris," Linda said, her eyes filled with tears. "I deserve better than this." Chris stood, his expression softening. "Linda, wait." "No," she said firmly. "I've waited long enough. I've fought for this marriage, but I can't fight alone." She walked out of the house, the weight of her decision heavy but freeing. For the first time in years, Linda felt a spark of hope, not for her marriage, but for herself. "You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine." Linda drove through the bustling streets of Lagos, the city lights blurring through her tear-filled eyes. The drive to one of her properties felt like a lifetime. As she pulled into the driveway, she sat in the car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The house was cold and unfamiliar when she stepped inside, her heels echoing against the tiled floor. It had been years since she'd set foot there. Dust lingered on the furniture, the air stale with abandonment. Closing the door behind her, Linda leaned against it and slid to the floor, burying her face in her hands as the weight of her reality crushed her. Her body shook with silent sobs, the only sound in the emptiness of the house. For days, Linda stayed confined to her room. She refused to eat, her body growing weak. The only movement came when she dragged herself to the bathroom, or shifted to the edge of her bed, to gaze out the window. The memories of her life with Chris haunted her like a relentless ghost. His cruel words, the disdain in his eyes, and the betrayal that shattered her heart. "Why me?" she whispered into the quiet. "Why does everything I touch fall apart? What did I do to deserve this?" One afternoon, a soft knock interrupted the suffocating silence. Linda ignored it at first, but the knocking persisted. She reluctantly shuffled to the door and opened it to find Clara, her closest friend, standing there with a bag of groceries. "Linda, you haven't been answering my calls," Clara said, her eyes scanning Linda's disheveled appearance. "Look at you, you're wasting away." "I'm fine," Linda mumbled, avoiding Clara's gaze. "No, you're not," Clara said firmly, stepping inside. She set the groceries on the counter and turned to Linda, placing her hands on her shoulders. "It's okay to feel broken, but you can't let this destroy you. You're stronger than this, Linda." Tears welled up in Linda's eyes as she collapsed into Clara's arms, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. "He betrayed me, Clara. He replaced me like I meant nothing. And his mother, I know," Clara whispered, stroking Linda's back. "But you're more than this pain. You'll rise above it. I promise you." Clara stayed with Linda for the rest of the day, tidying up the house and making sure she ate something. When Clara finally left, Linda sat in the quiet, her heart a little lighter but still aching. She stared at her phone for a long time before finally calling her lawyer. "I want to file for a divorce," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. The decision brought a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. That night, Linda lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. "I won't let this break me," she whispered. The next morning, Linda woke up with a renewed determination. She made a list of essentials, got dressed, and drove to the market. The vibrant chaos of the city greeted her, a stark contrast to the stillness she had been living in. At the market, Linda felt a flicker of life returning. The vendors' loud calls, the scent of spices, and the vibrant colors of fresh produce reminded her of the world's vibrancy. She bought everything she needed to transform her house into a home, a symbol of her new beginning. Back at home, Linda cleaned every corner of the house, scrubbing away not just the dust but the remnants of her despair. She cooked a pot of jollof rice and fried chicken, the aroma filling the house and lifting her spirits. Sitting at the dining table, she ate slowly, savoring every bite. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of accomplishment. Afterward, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sunset. The following day, Linda returned to her business. Her customers greeted her with smiles and warmth, and she responded in kind, pouring her energy into her work. Slowly but surely, her confidence grew as she saw her efforts paying off. Her business began to thrive, and Linda started to rebuild the life she had almost lost. She realized that while Chris had broken her heart, he hadn't broken her spirit. She was stronger than she had ever imagined. As she locked up her shop one evening, Linda looked up at the sky. The stars twinkled brightly, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself, a newfound determination lighting up her eyes. Chris leaned back in his plush sofa, a glass of wine in his hand, as the soft melodies of jazz music filled the room. Beside him, his new wife, Sharon, laughed heartily at a joke he had just made. The laughter felt forced to Chris, but he ignored the nagging feeling in his chest. His mother, Mama Rose, sat across from them, her eyes glowing with approval as she admired Sharon. "Sharon, my dear, you're a breath of fresh air in this family," Mama Rose said, her voice warm. "You've brought so much happiness to my son's life. I can't thank you enough." Sharon beamed, leaning into Chris. "It's my pleasure, Mama. Chris has been nothing but amazing to me." Chris smiled faintly but said nothing. He took a sip of his wine, his mind wandering to the past. It had been months since he and Linda had separated. Though he told himself he had moved on, there were nights when memories of Linda crept into his mind uninvited. Her laughter, her gentleness, and the way she had once looked at him with unconditional love haunted him. He brushed the thoughts aside, telling himself that Sharon was all he needed now. Mama Rose's voice broke into his thoughts. "We need to take a family portrait soon, Chris. I'll frame it and put it in the living room." Chris nodded absent-mindedly. "Sure, Mama." Over the next few weeks, Mama Rose continued to shower Sharon with gifts and public displays of affection. She often posted pictures of Sharon and Chris on social media, writing captions like, "My beautiful daughter-in-law" and "the woman who brought sunshine into our lives." Mama Rose had never done this for Linda, not even once in the 5 years they had been married. Linda had always been met with cold indifference, treated as though her inability to conceive was her sole-defining trait. Linda stumbled upon one of Mama Rose's posts one evening while scrolling through her phone. It was a picture of Sharon and Chris at a fancy restaurant, with a caption that read, "True love is a blessing from God." Linda's stomach churned as she stared at the image. A mix of anger and sadness welled up in her chest, but she quickly shook it off. She had promised herself she wouldn't let their lives affect her anymore. She closed the app and put her phone aside, taking a deep breath. "They can have their happiness," she muttered to herself. "I have my own life to live." And live she did. Linda poured herself into her work, expanding her business and building a reputation for excellence. She made new friends, joined a fitness club, and started attending social events. Slowly but surely, the wounds Chris and his family had inflicted began to heal. One evening, as Linda locked up her shop, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She walked down the bustling street, her heart light. The city lights twinkled like stars, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. Chris and Sharon, meanwhile, appeared to have the perfect life. Sharon posted pictures of their outings, expensive gifts Chris bought her, and the luxurious vacations they took. To outsiders, they were the epitome of happiness. But behind closed doors, cracks began to appear. Sharon was not Linda. She was flashy, demanding, and materialistic. She expected Chris to cater to her every whim, and when he didn't, Arguments erupted. Chris often found himself comparing her to Linda, though he would never admit it out loud. One evening, Chris returned home from work to find Sharon lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Shopping bags littered the floor, and the scent of her expensive perfume filled the air. "Sharon, what's all this?" Chris asked, gesturing to the bags. "I went shopping," Sharon said nonchalantly, not looking up from her phone. "With my credit card again?" Chris's voice was sharp. Sharon finally looked up, a smirk on her face. "Of course. What's the big deal? You can afford it." "That's not the point, Sharon. You can't keep spending money like this. We have other responsibilities." Sharon rolled her eyes and stood up. "Responsibilities? Chris, we're expecting a baby, not raising a family of 10. You're acting like we're drowning in bills." Her dismissive tone irritated Chris, but he chose to let it slide, clenching his jaw as he stared at her. Chris stared at her, his chest heaving with suppressed anger. Without another word, he turned and walked away, slamming the bedroom door behind him. Sharon's laughter followed him, mocking and cold. As he sat on the edge of the bed, Chris felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He thought about Linda, how she had never demanded anything from him, how she had always been content with what they had. He hated himself for letting her go, for listening to his mother's venomous words instead of standing by his wife. Mama Rose, oblivious to the tension in Chris's new marriage, continued to dote on Sharon. She visited often, bringing gifts and praising Sharon for being the perfect wife. But even she couldn't ignore the growing strain between Chris and Sharon. One afternoon, as Mama Rose sat with Sharon in the living room, she noticed the younger woman's dismissive attitude toward Chris. Sharon barely acknowledged him when he came home, her focus entirely on her phone or the television. "Sharon, is everything okay between you and Chris?" Mama Rose asked gently. Sharon shrugged. "We're fine, Mama. Just the usual marriage stuff." Mama Rose frowned but didn't press further. She couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had pushed Chris to leave Linda, believing Sharon would be a better match. But now, she wasn't so sure. Linda, on the other hand, was thriving. Her business had expanded beyond her expectations, and she had become a well-known name in her industry. She no longer thought about Chris and Sharon, focusing instead on her happiness and success. One evening, Linda attended a networking event for entrepreneurs. Dressed in an elegant blue dress that hugged her curves, she exuded confidence. As she mingled with other attendees, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a tall, handsome man with a warm smile. "Hello, I'm Paul," he said, extending his hand. "Engineer Paul." Linda smiled, shaking his hand. "Nice to meet you, Paul. I'm Linda." "I couldn't help but notice you from across the room," Paul said. "You have a captivating presence." Linda laughed softly, a blush creeping up her cheeks. "Thank you." They spent the rest of the evening talking, and by the end of the night, Paul asked for her number. Linda hesitated for a moment before giving it to him. It had been so long since she had let herself feel this way, hopeful, excited, and alive. Over the next few weeks, Paul called and texted regularly. He was kind, attentive, and respectful, qualities Linda hadn't realized she missed. When he asked her out on a date, she agreed, her heart fluttering with anticipation. Paul took her to a beautiful rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. The atmosphere was magical, with soft lighting and gentle music. As they ate, Linda found herself opening up about her past. She told Paul about Chris, the betrayal, and the pain she had endured. Paul listened intently, his expression serious. "Linda, you've been through so much, but look at you now. You're strong, successful, and incredible. I can't promise to erase your past, but I can promise to be the man who shows you what love should feel like." Linda felt tears prick her eyes, but she smiled. "Thank you, Paul. That means a lot." As the evening ended, Paul walked her to her car and held her hand. "I hope tonight was the start of something beautiful." Linda nodded, her heart full for the first time in years. "I hope so too." Years later, Linda's life had taken a remarkable turn. Her thriving business was now a well-known brand, with several branches in the city. The once timid and heartbroken woman had transformed into a confident, self-assured entrepreneur. Yet, the most unexpected change in her life wasn't her professional success, it was Paul. Paul had proven to be a steady rock in her life. From the day they met, He had been patient and consistent, never wavering in his devotion to her. He wasn't just a man who wanted her, he was a man who valued her. Their relationship grew steadily over the years, built on mutual respect and understanding. Linda smiled as she recalled the day Paul surprised her with flowers at her shop. It wasn't an extravagant gesture, but it was thoughtful. Every little thing he did showed her that he cared, and she found herself letting her guard down more and more. Meanwhile, Chris's life seemed perfect on the surface. His wife, Sharon, had given birth to a beautiful son who was now 3 years old. Sharon had become a social media sensation, constantly posting pictures of their family outings, vacations, and luxury lifestyle. Chris's mother, Mama Rose, adored Sharon, treating her like the daughter she had always wanted. It was a far cry from how she had treated Linda during her marriage to Chris. Mama Rose showered Sharon with gifts, proudly showcasing her on her social media pages with captions like, "My lovely daughter-in-law" and "God has blessed my son with a perfect wife." Linda, though she tried to avoid it, would occasionally stumble across these posts. At first, they stung. It wasn't just the betrayal but the hypocrisy that hurt. Mama Rose had never celebrated her during her marriage to Chris, but over time, Linda had learned to let go of the anger. Those memories were nothing more than a distant chapter of her life. Paul had become a regular visitor at Linda's shop, often stopping by to check on her or bring her lunch. One afternoon, as they sat in her office sharing a meal, Paul leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on hers. "Linda," he began, his tone serious. "Have you ever thought about getting married again?" Linda froze. The question lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. She set her fork down and looked at him. "Paul, I've thought about it," she admitted, "but I'm scared. Marriage. It broke me before." Paul reached for her hand, his touch reassuring. "I understand your fears, Linda, but I want you to know that I'm not him. I'll never treat you the way he did. All I want is to make you happy." Tears welled up in Linda's eyes. She could see the sincerity in his gaze, the genuine love he had for her. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay, Paul, let's take it one step at a time." Their relationship blossomed even further after that conversation. Paul made it a point to show Linda what a healthy, loving partnership looked like. He involved her in every aspect of his life, introducing her to his family and friends, who welcomed her with open arms. For the first time in years, Linda felt like she was part of a family. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Paul's home, watching the sunset, he pulled out a small velvet box. "Linda," he said, getting down on one knee, "you're the love of my life. I want to spend the rest of my days making you happy. Will you marry me?" Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The words she had always dreamed of hearing, but never thought she would, echoed in her ears. With tears streaming down her face, she nodded. "Yes, Paul. Yes. I'll marry you." Their wedding was simple yet beautiful, just as Linda had wanted. It was held at a small church with only close friends and family in attendance. Linda wore a modest white gown, and Paul looked dashing in a tailored suit. As they exchanged vows, Linda felt a weight lift off her shoulders. This was her fresh start, a new beginning. A few months after their wedding, Linda began to feel strange. She was constantly tired, her appetite had changed, and she often felt nauseous. Concerned, Paul insisted she visit the doctor. After a series of tests, the doctor smiled at her. "Congratulations, Mrs. Paul, you're pregnant." Linda's heart skipped a beat. "Pregnant?" she repeated, almost in disbelief. "Yes," the doctor confirmed, "and not just with one baby. You're having triplets." Linda sat in stunned silence for a moment before a smile broke across her face. She couldn't wait to tell Paul. When she got home, she found Paul in the living room, engrossed in a book. She walked up to him, her heart racing with excitement. "Paul," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I have some news." He looked up, concern flashing in his eyes. "What is it? Are you okay?" Linda nodded, a wide grin spreading across her face. "I'm pregnant, and we're having triplets." Paul's eyes widened in shock. "Triplets? Are you serious?" Linda laughed, nodding. "Yes, Paul. We're going to be parents of 3 babies." Paul pulled her into a tight embrace, his joy evident. "This is the best news ever, Linda. I can't wait to meet our little ones." Back in Chris's home, Sharon was busy planning her son's 4th birthday party. She wanted it to be the grandest event of the year, complete with a celebrity guest list and expensive decorations. Chris, however, had begun to notice cracks in their seemingly perfect life. Sharon's lavish lifestyle was draining his finances, and her constant need for attention was exhausting. One night, as they sat in their living room, Chris voiced his concerns. "Sharon, don't you think we're spending too much? We need to be more careful with our finances." Sharon rolled her eyes. "Chris, what's the point of having money if we don't enjoy it? Besides, we have a reputation to maintain." Chris sighed. He missed the simplicity of his life with Linda. Sharon's beauty and charm had initially captivated him, but he was beginning to see the superficiality beneath it all. Linda's pregnancy journey wasn't easy. Carrying triplets came with its challenges, but Paul was by her side every step of the way. He attended every doctor's appointment, helped her with household chores, and even learned how to cook her favorite meals. On the day of their baby shower, Linda was surrounded by love and support. Her friends and family came together to celebrate the impending arrival of her babies. As she sat in a chair, watching Paul interact with their guests, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in years, Linda felt truly happy. The months flew by as Linda's pregnancy advanced. Paul remained the loving and devoted husband she had always dreamed of. Their days were filled with excitement as they prepared for the arrival of their triplets. Linda spent her time designing the nursery, picking out baby clothes, and creating a safe and welcoming environment for her children. Paul, on the other hand, busied himself with setting up a college fund and ensuring they had everything they would need for their growing family. Though their lives were consumed by preparations, Linda still took moments to reflect on how far she had come. The pain of her past seemed like a distant memory now. She could hardly believe that the woman who had once felt abandoned, broken, and betrayed was now basking in the joy of a new, loving marriage. But despite the happiness that surrounded her, Linda still carried the scar of her previous marriage. The trauma from her relationship with Chris still lingered in her heart, and it was something she hadn't fully confronted yet. As she stared at the nursery she had so lovingly decorated, she realized that, perhaps, it was time for a new chapter in her emotional healing. She had come so far, but there were still pieces of her heart that needed to be mended. Meanwhile, Chris was trying to come to terms with the unraveling of his perfect life. His son, Marcus, had just celebrated his 4th birthday, but it wasn't the joyous occasion he had imagined. The lavish party, with its expensive decorations and celebrity guests, had left Chris feeling more disconnected from his family than ever before. Sharon, ever the socialite, had pulled all the strings to make sure the event was a success. But Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't just Sharon's extravagant spending habits that bothered him. It was the realization that he had been living a life of illusion, one built on materialism and superficial appearances. The more time he spent with Sharon, the more he realized he longed for the simple things, the real connections that had once grounded him. In the midst of his internal struggle, Chris received a call that changed everything. "Hello?" he answered, his voice shaky. "Chris," came the familiar voice of his ex-wife, "Linda, it's been a while. How are you?" Chris froze. He hadn't expected to hear from Linda, not after everything that had happened. For a moment, he was unsure how to respond. I'm fine," he finally said, his voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. "I'm glad," Linda replied, her tone warm but distant. "I wanted to let you know that I'm doing well. I'm married now. I'm expecting triplets." Chris's heart skipped a beat. He had known that Linda had remarried, but hearing her say it so casually, as though she had moved on entirely, hit him harder than he had expected. "Triplets?" he repeated, his voice low. That's amazing, Linda. I'm happy for you." He meant it deep down. Despite everything that had happened, he truly did want her to be happy. But hearing her live the life he had once envisioned with her made him feel like he had missed out on something irreplaceable. Back in Linda's life, things were moving forward with the arrival of their triplets. The day had finally come. Her water broke in the early hours of the morning. Paul rushed her to the hospital, his heart racing as he helped her settle into the delivery room. Linda was in pain, but she was calm. She knew that Paul would be there for her, and that knowledge gave her strength. As the hours passed, Linda's contractions grew stronger. The nurses and doctors surrounded her, but it was Paul's comforting presence that helped ease her discomfort. "You're doing great, Linda," Paul whispered, holding her hand. "Just a little longer. We're going to meet our babies soon." She nodded, her grip tightening around his hand. Finally, after hours of labor, Linda gave birth to 3 beautiful babies, 2 girls and a boy. The doctors cleaned them up and placed them in her arms. And Linda couldn't help but cry. She had never felt so full of love and gratitude. Paul stood beside her, his eyes shining with emotion. "They're perfect, Linda. Our family is perfect." Linda smiled, tears streaming down her face as she looked at their little ones. It was a new beginning. A new chapter for her and Paul, and she couldn't wait to see what the future held for their growing family. Meanwhile, Chris found himself at a crossroads. His son Marcus had been acting strangely lately, complaining of headaches and feeling unusually tired. Sharon brushed it off, chalking it up to the stress of the party. But Chris couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. He insisted they take Marcus to the doctor for a checkup. Sharon reluctantly agreed, and they made an appointment. The news that followed would change everything. "Mr. and Mrs. Chris," the doctor said solemnly, "we've run some tests, and it appears that Marcus is in need of a blood transfusion. His condition is quite serious, and we need to act quickly." Chris felt as though the floor had been ripped out from beneath him. His mind raced as he processed the information. His son, his flesh and blood, was gravely ill, and there was nothing he could do. The doctor explained that they would need to find a blood match, and Chris immediately offered to donate. However, after several tests, the doctor informed him that he wasn't a match. Chris's heart sank. He couldn't believe it. He had always assumed that as a father, he would be able to help his child in any way possible. Desperation set in. "You mean to tell me I can't help my own son?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The doctor nodded. "We will need to find another donor." Days later, as Chris continued to grapple with the possibility that he couldn't help his son, a thought crossed his mind. What if Marcus wasn't his son? What if Sharon had lied to him about the paternity? The results came a few days later, and when Chris saw the report, his entire world came crashing down. The test confirmed what he had feared. The child he had raised as his own was not biologically his. He could hardly breathe as the shock set in. He had been betrayed, not just by his wife, but by the very foundation of his family. When he confronted Sharon with the news, she denied everything, begging him to keep the secret. "Chris, please," she pleaded. "I did it because I thought you would leave me if you knew. You're the only one who's been there for me." But Chris wasn't having it. His anger flared, and his voice trembled with emotion. "After everything we've been through, you do this to me?" he shouted. "You lied to me about our son. I've done everything for you, Sharon. Everything." He couldn't take it anymore. He kicked her out of their home, demanding she leave with the child. Back in Linda's world, life with Paul and their triplets was blissful. She had found everything she had ever wanted: love, happiness, and a family. The pain of her past seemed like a distant memory, and she had finally learned to forgive herself for everything that had happened. One evening, as she tucked her children into bed, her phone rang. It was a familiar number. Linda hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she said, her voice wary. "Linda, it's me, Chris," came the voice on the other end. Her heart skipped a beat. What could he possibly want now? "I miss you, Linda," he said softly. "I've made so many mistakes. Can we talk?" But Linda, her heart now full and whole with the love of her family, didn't hesitate. "No, Chris," she replied firmly. "You're in my past now. I'm happy, and I won't let you hurt me again." With that, she hung up. Years had passed since Linda's life had been rebuilt. The pain of her past no longer controlled her. She had grown into a confident, independent woman, deeply in love with her husband Paul, and their 3 beautiful children. Every morning, she woke up with a sense of peace in her heart, knowing that she had found happiness once more. Her journey, once filled with sorrow and heartbreak, had led her to a place of contentment and gratitude. Linda spent her days surrounded by the love of her children and the unwavering support of Paul. The couple's business had flourished, and they had moved into a spacious home in the suburbs, where they enjoyed a quiet life far away from the drama of their pasts. The nursery that had once been filled with uncertainty now held laughter and joy as the triplets grew older, their bright eyes shining with innocence. One evening, As Linda sat on the porch with Paul, watching the sunset, she took a deep breath and smiled. "I'm so grateful, Paul," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "Grateful for everything. For you, for the kids, for this life. I never thought I would have this peace, love, and a family of my own." Paul, sitting beside her, reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm grateful for you, Linda. You've brought so much light into my life. You make everything better." Linda leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to reflect on the past, not with pain or resentment, but with a sense of understanding. The journey she had been through had shaped her into the woman she was today. Every tear, every hardship, had taught her valuable lessons, and now she was stronger because of it. As she looked at the family they had built, Linda realized just how far she had come. Her journey was no longer defined by the betrayal of her ex-husband or the anguish of her lost dreams. She had found her own happiness, and she had built a future filled with love, trust, and stability. But even as Linda reveled in her newfound peace, there was someone else who could not escape the weight of his decisions. Chris. Chris had spent the last few years trying to come to terms with the consequences of his actions. The paternity test had shattered his world, and his marriage to Sharon had crumbled in the wake of his discovery. He had kicked her out, angry and betrayed. But in the quiet moments that followed, he couldn't escape the regret that gnawed at him. He had never truly known what he had until it was gone. Chris's life had continued, but it was a hollow existence. His son, Marcus, had never been the same after the revelation, and the guilt weighed heavily on Chris's heart. The boy he had once raised as his own now felt like a stranger to him. His new marriage, built on shaky ground, had fallen apart just as quickly as it had begun. Sharon had left, taking Marcus with her, and Chris found himself alone, sitting in the emptiness of his own making. He often found himself thinking of Linda, the woman he had once taken for granted, the woman who had loved him with all her heart, only to be betrayed by him in the most painful way possible. He had broken her trust, shattered her spirit, and sent her down a path of heartbreak. And now, as he reflected on the choices he had made, he realized the depth of his mistakes. Chris had thought that life would continue as it always had, that he could have everything he wanted without consequences. But now, the walls he had built around himself had crumbled, leaving him to face the aftermath of his decisions. He had pushed Linda away, thinking that he could replace her, thinking that another woman could fill the void she had left. But he had been wrong. Sharon had been a temporary distraction, a way to avoid confronting his own flaws. But it hadn't been enough to fill the emptiness he felt inside. Now, Chris was left with the harsh reality that he had lost the one person who had truly mattered to him. One night, as he sat alone in his luxurious home, a feeling of despair washed over him. He had everything: wealth, status, and a successful career, but none of it brought him the peace he had once found in Linda's smile. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, pausing when he saw Linda's name. His heart ached as he stared at it. He had called her once before, a few years ago, but she had hung up on him. He hadn't been ready to hear the truth then. But now, he was desperate for a second chance. He needed to apologize, to tell her how deeply he regretted the way he had treated her. Taking a deep breath, Chris dialed her number. The phone rang once, twice, and then Linda's voice came through the line. "Hello?" She answered, her voice steady but polite. "Linda," Chris said, his voice full of emotion. "It's me, Chris." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Chris could feel the hesitation, the years of distance between them. "What do you want, Chris?" Linda's voice was calm, but there was an underlying firmness. She had moved on, but he could hear the remnants of pain in her tone. I wanted to apologize," Chris said, his words coming out more broken than he intended. "I know I can never undo what I did to you, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am. I took you for granted. I didn't see how good you were to me. I was blind to it all." Linda was silent for a moment, and Chris felt his chest tighten. The weight of his regrets seemed to bear down on him, but he had to say it all. "I've lost everything, Linda, and it's all my fault. I hurt you, and I can never take that back. I know you've moved on, but I just need you to hear me, to know how sorry I am for everything. I'll carry this regret for the rest of my life." Linda listened quietly, her heart heavy with the emotions Chris's words stirred within her. She had forgiven him in her heart long ago, not for his sake, but for her own peace. She had learned to let go of the anger and the resentment. But hearing him say the words, hearing him acknowledge his mistakes, made her realize just how far she had come. "I'm glad you finally understand, Chris," she said softly. "But I can't go back. I've built a life for myself. And it's a life I'm proud of. I have a family now. And I'm happy. I've forgiven you. But I've moved on. I can't allow you to hurt me again." Chris's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, the moment when Linda would firmly close the door on their past. And though it pained him, he understood. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of sorrow. "Thank you for everything. I truly hope you find the happiness you deserve." And with that, he hung up. Linda sat in the quiet of her home, the weight of the calls settling around her. She didn't feel angry or resentful. Instead, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had forgiven Chris, but she had also learned the importance of never settling for less than she deserved. Her life now was full of love and gratitude, and nothing could take that away. As she looked at Paul, who had walked into the room and sat beside her, she smiled. Her heart was whole again. Chris's regrets were his to carry, and hers was a life of joy, peace, and the love of her children. She had learned the most important lesson, that forgiveness wasn't just for the person who hurt you. It was for your own healing. And Linda had healed. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching till the end.